Hello, I'm Bob Ackerman, the editor-in-chief of Signal Magazine, and welcome to our Signal Media Executive Interview. Our guest today is Douglas Dudley, Director of Air Force Programs for Akima. Doug is a retired Air Force colonel with more than 28 years of experience as a career communications and cyberspace operations officer. Doug, welcome.
Oh, thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Let me ask this. The Air Force has been undergoing IT modernization for some time, just like other federal government organizations. As a retired Air Force colonel, what's your perspective on the Air Force's efforts there?
Okay, yeah, that's a really interesting question. Because of the time that I came into the Air Force, really I grew up and got to see that entire evolution and growth of IT networking and modernization in the Air Force. So let me kind of go back and take you through that journey just a little bit. And so when I came in to the Air Force in the early 90s, networking was really in its infancy. It wasn't really covered in our tech school class. You didn't see a whole lot of coverage of it in college courses at that point in time. So it was really, really new, especially in the Air Force. When I got to my first assignment, there was no network in the organization. Like back then, we didn't even use passwords on the computer, which is unimaginable today. And after about 6 months of being there, we finally got email using a dial-up server and CC mail. And so if I wanted to send an email to somebody in my organization in the next office over, I would go and log on to this computer, and I was in Nebraska, and I would dial up a email server down in Florida, and I would type up my email, and I would hit send, and I would log off, and I'd go back, and I'd walk next door, and I'd tell the person I was looking to send an email, I said, hey, I sent you an email. And when they wanted to get it, they would go log onto that computer, dial up the server, download their email, get their email. And so very, very beginnings of using email and networking in the Air Force. And after we'd been there for about a year, my team installed the first network in the squadron. It was a Windows 3.1.1 Windows for Work Groups peer-to-peer network. And we installed that and then expanded that to our parent organization over at headquarters SAC. And so what you see from that, network started out in the Air Force really is kind of homegrown with little or no standardization. And then by the mid 90s, MAGCOM started to take some control of the local networks, and there was some internal standardization across the Air Force major commands. But it was internal to the commands, and some commands had Banyan Vines, and some had Novell, some had Microsoft. There were a variety of solutions that were out there. And so there was standardization beginning within the major commands, but not between the major commands. And then this was the time the Air Force started talking about operationalizing and professionalizing the network. And that was the first real attempt that they made at trying to do some standardization. And we kind of went on that way for about 10 years until about the mid 2000s. And then we started talking about, AFNet ops consolidation. And this is really an effort by the Air Force to form some enterprise units, and we called them at the time integrated network operations and security centers. And that was in an attempt to begin to centrally manage and operate the network. And a couple of years later in that initiative, we kind of decided, the Air Force decided that really to achieve efficiencies in scale and security and cost, we really needed to create a single centrally managed network. And so that then was born, the concept of AFNet migration. And this is where Akima actually became involved with the Air Force back in about 2007 when the Air Force started the AFNet migration. We worked with the Air Force on a contract that we had up at Scott Air Force Base. We worked with the Air Force, we worked with Microsoft and others, and we basically designed, tested, and fielded the AFNet. And then, contractors from Akima did the migration under a contract that we had with the Air Force Communications Agency and later the Air Force Network Integration Center up at Scott. And it began with the active duty sites, and we did the active duty migration, and then we ended in roughly 2014 timeframe, finishing up the Air National Guard sites. In total, almost 300 sites migrated into the enterprise network. Now, part of that initiative also, the Air Force created enterprise service desks, and those were designed to be a centralized help desk for the Air Force, for customers to call to have turbo tickets worked. But they quickly determined that enterprise service desk couldn't keep up with the volume of support tickets that were out there. user experience was poor. Customers were on hold for over an hour in some cases. So working closely with Akima, the Air Force fielded what they call the Virtual Enterprise Service Desk, and that was an automated tool to do self-resolution of many common user problems that their customers would face. And if it couldn't automatically resolve that problem, they would open up a help desk ticket and submit the information that had already been obtained through the troubleshooting process to the technicians. And so that's a tool that Akima continues to support today. It resides on every machine in the Air Force and on the NIPRNet. And the last estimate that I heard while I was on active duty is that tool, the Virtual Enterprise Service Desk, auto resolves about 60% of the trouble tickets that are opened by a user. And so we continue to do modernization and sustainment of that tool today. One of our most recent efforts that has gone on in the Air Force that Akima also supported was the move to cloud-hosted enterprise services. That working with the Air Force and others, Akima assisted with the design, planning, and testing, and then executed the migration of accounts over to Chess. And so that was taking email and collaboration services out to the Office 365 cloud. We migrated over 1 million accounts out to the cloud. And according to Microsoft, that was the largest Office 365 deployment in the world. And there are other cloud migration efforts that are going on. A lot of those are being done under the Cloud One program, around out of AFL-CIMC H&I up at Hanscom. And so that's kind of where we're at today. You see, this has been an ongoing evolution over the last 30 years. Networks and IT has really gone from being a tool to do email and file sharing to a critical enabling capability today that every airman and guardian depends on to execute their daily mission. And today, the Air Force kind of stands at the next phase of that evolution with the efforts that they're doing underneath the Enterprise IT as a Service initiative. So, Bob, that's kind of a quick summary of where we've come over the last 30 years in the Air Force.
Well, let's dive a little deeper into Air Force IT service management. Well, the service has hundreds of thousands of users around the globe, and it faces daily service requests amid strategic level initiatives such as cybersecurity and cloud migration. How does the Air Force address this?
Well, so I think there's three critical components. This is something that I lived every day in my career, particularly towards the end. Both as a customer of these services when I was a director of communications at Air Force Materiel Command, and then later as a service provider when I was a commander of the Air Force Network Integration Center, Scott, for the last 2.5 years that I was in the Air Force. And so from my experience, like I said, there's three major areas that I think that the Air Force has to focus on, and that's governance, configuration management, and customer focus. And the first, starting off with governance, means the Air Force needs to have strong governance to control what can and cannot be done on the network. It needs strong governance that can determine who's authorized to do that work on the network and to control when and how that work is being done. But they have to make sure that it's not governance solely for the sake of having governance, and it can't be rigid and inflexible, that's impossible or extremely difficult to change. It needs to be common sense governance that's flexible, that's also agile and dynamic enough to change to meet the needs of the warfighter when those change. And I'll give you a kind of an example of that, and I'll go back to the cloud-hosted enterprise services effort that the Air Force did here recently. Like I said, Akima was the contractor on that. One of the big issues that everybody had was latency, and a lot of that latency was due to the transactional path between a user's machine out to the cloud. And there was some unbelievable number of devices and firewalls that resided in that transactional path of getting data from the customer's machine, the user's machine, out to the cloud. The number, something like 47 different firewall type devices were in that path. And nobody wanted to design it that way. And frankly, no sensible person would really have designed it that way. And we wanted to change it. But most of those devices existed because of policy and governance that existed. And it's taken years to change those policies and to begin to see a reduction in the number of devices that can in that transactional path that allows us to improve performance and have better response times for the customer. And I think that's why efforts that the Air Force is doing right now, such as Operation Flamethrower, which was put in place by the current Air Force CIO, Ms. Laura Nossenberger, and the Air Combat Command Director of Communications, Brigadier General Chad Radke, are so critical what the Air Force is looking to go in the future. And Operation Flamethrower, if you haven't heard of it, is an initiative that was put in place to develop an expedited process to identify and eliminate outdated, restrictive, and unnecessarily policy and guidance that's out there. And so I think they're making a lot of strides with that, and I think we'll continue to see a lot of progress and a lot of improvements in that area in governance. The second area that I mentioned was configuration management. It kind of goes hand in hand with governance. In order to manage your network, you need to know your network and you need to understand it. And I think this, over my career, that's an area that I saw that the Air Force has struggled, in part because too many people have the ability to make changes on the network. But you need to know what's being changed on the network, who's authorized to make those changes, and who's actually making those changes. And so while I was up at the Air Force Network Integration Center back in 2018, the 24th Air Force Vice Commander, Brigadier General Mitch Bukoffer, came to me and said, "Hey, Doug, we need your help, identifying, developing, and automating standard enterprise change configuration management process to use on the Air Force enterprise." And so I put together a team, a government industry team, which again consisted of Akima, because they were one of our large contractors up there at the center, and to address that issue. And so starting with a collection of what we found of 217 disparate, non-standardized, and often duplicative change process models, we worked and helped the Air Force reduce that number down to 49 universally relevant models with automated workflows that could be used across the entire enterprise. And that reduced hundreds of labor hours needed to process and approve change requests for the Air Force enterprise. And that's a key initiative to getting a handle on change and configuration management in the Air Force. And then the third thing I mentioned was a focus for the customer. And I think in some cases that can serve as a check and balance to the first two. When your configuration management gets to be too stringent or your governance gets to be too stringent, you tend to see examples of that in things like user performance and frankly user experience. And that's the term that's common for that today, is user experience. Too often we in the IT community measure what we think is important to us and not what's important to the customer. And I think anybody can tell you can have 5 nines availability and meet all your service level agreements and your uptime and your ticket closure times. But if the are too cumbersome for our airmen and guardians to get their job done, then it's not mission. So when you go out and you talk to users across the Air Force and U.S. Space Force today, they will talk about latency and accessing information in sites. They'll talk about clunky software, poor experience. And I actually used to experience this myself, even as the commander of AFNIC and as a service provider, with so many things that are going on. And the latency that I would occasionally experience on the network, I could literally try to go out to a website, and the amount of time that it took me to access that site, by the time I got there, I had forgotten why I had originally gone out there and what I intended to accomplish. That's a huge productivity drain. And that was happening across the entire Air Force. I think the Air Force has made a lot of progress in this area in recent years. One of the things they did, they installed a chief experience officer, Mr. Cole Whitall, up the air staff, who has the direction to oversee what the Air Force is doing from the perspective of user experience. And there's a lot of things that fall underneath the perspective of user experience. And I'll just mention a couple here because there's some things that also Akima has been involved with. One of the efforts that they started was called Role IT. And it was an initiative to take a look across the enterprise and see what we could do to improve that experience for the user. And Akima has been involved with that in a couple of areas. Our engineers have been looking at transactional path across the entire enterprise. And we've also been supporting cleanup of base login scripts and eliminating outdated and duplicative group policy objects, all with a goal to help make the network more responsive and to reduce user login times. So those are my 3 thoughts, on what the Air Force can do to best manage from an enterprise perspective.
Okay. But given that, what would you say is the best approach to meet Air Force IT needs, both unique and common to other defense organizations?
So I'd like to talk about some of the things that Akima can do to help along those lines, some of the experience that we've got and some of the things that we've done to be able to help, not only the Air Force, but our other customers. I think one of the first things I'd like to mention is what we've done over time is we've gained experience. In particular, we've talked about the Air Force already. We talked about a number of the things that Akima has done for the Air Force, such as migration, virtual enterprise service desk, chess migrations. We do a lot more as well. So several of our contracts for the Air Force. One thing people don't know, we do tier 3 help desk for the entire core services for the Air Force network. We're involved in incident and problem management. Anytime there's an incident on the Air Force network, they'll stand up an incident management team, and Akima participates in that through our contract that we have up at the center up at Scott. Also part of that contract, we do project implementation, operations, and sustainment. So about any given time, there's probably about 30 to 40 ongoing projects across the Air Force enterprise that Akima is involved with in doing implementation. We've done a lot of work with the Air Force in IT service management. The Cyberspace Capability Center up at Scott is the lead for service transition underneath ITSM, and we worked with the government and helped design the service transition processes that they use, and also worked with the Air Staff and 16th Air Force on the other IT service management processes in the other areas of ITIL. We do capacity planning, auditing, dashboarding. Another one of our large contracts that we have has given us a lot of experience in the Air Force is our Active Directory Tech Refresh contract, where we've gone out and we've replaced equipment at nearly 200 sites around the globe on the Air Force network. New compute and store and network equipment out there to help update and upgrade the Air Force network. And all of these areas combined position Akima very well to help meet Air Force needs and make us a strong contender and a partner in what the Air Force is looking to do in the future with respect to enterprise IT as a service. But it's more than just Air Force experience. Akima has been in federal contracting for nearly 30 years. And so we have customers across the entire federal government. We do IT and network operations and risk management support for the Army's Office of Surgeon General. We do database support and service to the U.S. Patent and Trade Office and the Federal Drug Administration. We support the intel community and the Army underneath our Army Intelligence and Security Command contract at Fort Belvoir. We do SharePoint services for the IRS. And then a kind of interesting area, we run the Security Operations Center in the Department of Interior under the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So Akima is truly a service provider to the whole of government. In addition to that, a second area which I think gives us a unique ability to better support our customers is our shared services model that we have. We haven't really talked anything about the structure of Akima, but simply to say there are over 40 operating companies underneath Akima. About 10 or 12 of those do IT and cyber related services. And those operating companies hold the contracts with our customers and they perform the work for our customers. But they have reached back to our Akima corporate for what we call our shared services model, where they get support in the areas of contracting and finance and recruiting, HR, accounting, legal, security, those types of services. And so that gives our operating companies a flexibility and agility to support our customers as a small business, but has a reach back to a corporate capability and experience gained over those 30 years to these shared services with capabilities that are on par to what you'd expect to find in a Fortune 500 company. Next thing I'd mention, so we do a lot in investing in our people. And one of those areas, first off, is deals with certifications. So we probably have over 500 cyber and IT certifications in 20 separate areas within our employees in Akima. Everything from ITIL and PMP to CISM and CISP, Security Plus. We have a large number of vendor-specific certifications that are out there within our workforce. And we get some more specific and specialty certifications held by our employees, such as ethical hacking, computer forensics, penetration testing, and things like that. And so we pay for work certifications that are required for the job. And you look at it and say, most contractors and most vendors probably do that. But in addition to that, we've got a really strong program where we focus on education for our employees above and beyond initial certifications. We pay $5,500 a year for education towards other educational and training requirements that our employees would like to take. And this can be anything. If somebody wants to work on a master's degree, if somebody wants to work on a new certification that isn't aligned to their current job, but they just want to do that, they can use those funds to pursue those education opportunities. And I'm actually doing that right now myself, pursuing a graduate certificate in data science through the University of Texas in Austin. So it's a really good program, probably one of the best ones that I've seen out there in my time, um, through in industry. And then I'd also like to mention partnerships. So one of our companies, Affigent, is a reseller, and through Affigent, we have got top tier partnerships with many vendors out there, hardware and software. That allows us to give discount pricing to our customers, and it gives us also not only the ability to sell in hardware and software products, but given the other operating companies we have that provide services, we can perform installations and sustainment depending on the customer needs. And then finally, I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Akima's capabilities aren't limited to IT and cyber. We also do facilities maintenance and repair, logistics and supply chain, construction, protective services, systems engineering, and mission support, and furniture, fixtures, and equipment. So as you can see, we've got a wide variety of capabilities within Akima that can support the needs of our DoD and federal customers.
Okay, let's go back to the Air Force. From your perspective, what lies ahead for Air Force IT?
Okay, well, I think you hear it from the Air Force senior leaders all the time. If you attend any of the conferences and FCA events, a lot of times you'll hear them talk about the need for the Air Force to become a digital Air Force. And they need to do that to get after what's needed in the areas of data science and big data, AI, machine learning, and to gain and maintain decision superiority in the all-domain fight with the Advanced Battle Management System, which is the Air Force's component of Joint All-Domain Command and Control. And kind of the underlying initiative that supports all of that is something I've talked about here or mentioned briefly throughout the conversation today, which is enterprise IT as a service. If you listen to senior leaders, there's some things that you hear common. And this one I'll attribute to Lieutenant General Wegeman, who's the former 24th Air Force commander and the current ACC deputy commander. And when you listen to him speak about where the Air Force is going, one of the things that he often says is, the Air Force can have enterprise IT as a service without ABMS, but they can't have ABMS without enterprise IT as a service. And that's because enterprise IT as a service is a fundamental enabling capability for the Air Force to achieve its goals. And it's an imperative to success in what the Air Force wants to do. So, and the whole concept really behind that is that, IT is a core competency of the of industry, and not a core competency of the Air Force. And so they want to allow industry to fill that role so our airmen and guardians can focus on their core competencies, which is to fly, fight, and win in airspace and cyberspace. So I was involved with ITES back in its early stages in 2017. And so I'd like to kind of offer a couple of observations from my perspective and my history in the Air Force, as the Air Force moves ahead with enterprise IT as a service. And the first one of those I'd like to say is, like I've told everybody all along, the Air Force is on a journey. And it's a journey to transition from being a service provider of IT services to being a consumer. And so ITAS is not a destination. It's not an end state. It's a journey that's going to take place, and it's going to continue to evolve. And as you can see from the earlier discussions that we had today, it's an ongoing evolution. And what the Air Force needs today is not what the Air Force is going to need 5 years from now. And so this is enterprise IT service is really another continuing phase of that ongoing journey that the Air Force has been on over the last 30 years, and it's going to continue into the future. And I think that's important to keep in mind as this effort moves forward, lest people get frustrated and it tends to the effort stagnates or people grow disillusioned with the progress. It's a journey. It's going to take time, and there probably ever be an end to that journey. It's going to continue to evolve, and we've seen that through all the efforts that have gone on over the last 30 years in the Air Force. The other thing I'd like to mention is that we need to learn from the lessons that we've observed in the past. I say lessons learned. A lot of people talk about lessons learned. I talk about lessons observed, because unless you take those lessons and you apply them in the future, they're not really a lesson learned. You may have observed it, but if you haven't internalized it and act on it, then you haven't learned from it. And so a lot of things can be learned from the different initiatives that have gone on in the Air Force over the last 30 years. And most of those initiatives have all been undertaken with an expectation, of some sort of savings and efficiencies. And what you can see if you look back is a lot of times those didn't pan out as expected. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. And the first one deals with when the Air Force did AFNet consolidation. So functions and personnel were moved from base level in the MAJCOMs to these centralized organizations, the INOS, to run the enterprise. And there were certain expectations that were out there about what functions could transfer and would transfer and what would stay behind at the local units. And one of the things that we've seen over time has been that typically more stays behind or gets returned to the lower echelon units over time due to necessity than was originally anticipated. And so the Air Force needs to keep that in mind as they move forward and make the decisions about how they're going to shift resources to fill other roles, and realize that what they think is going to happen today may not be the outcome that they get in the end. And there are probably going to be roles that are going to have to continue that they initially felt or thought was going to roll over to this commercial service provider that's going to do enterprise IT as a service for the Air Force. The second example along those lines was with cloud-hosted enterprise services. There was an expectation that the majority of the work of managing enterprise email for the Air Force would shift to a commercial service provider. I can tell you today there is still a large number of personnel in our network operations squadrons underneath 16th Air Force today that continue to work email issues. So that's a key thing to keep in mind as well as they look at resource allocation. And then the other thing I mentioned in the end, this is going to be a significant culture change for the Air Force. And as we all know, culture change takes time. And I think it's more of a culture change for the IT and cyber professionals than it's going to be for the end user. And I think what we need to realize moving forward is that, our IT and cyber professionals are not going to be able to continue to operate the way they always have in the past. They're going to have to give up some level of control to the commercial vendor who's running the networks. And our cybersecurity professionals may not be able to do all the things that they want to do on the network, because in reality, it's no longer the Air Force's network. It's going to belong to that vendor. And I think this is probably one of the toughest things, this culture change, going to be one of the toughest challenges as the Air Force moves forward, especially on the IT and cyber provider side of the house as they move into enterprise IT as a service. I think the ongoing risk reduction effort that's been happening over the last several years is helping sort this out, and it's starting us down the path of understanding those things. But again, I think this is going to be one of the biggest challenges associated with the success of ITAS, is this change of culture within the Air Force and the IT and cyber community. And so the Air Force needs to manage that culture change and the expectations associated with ITAS for the effort to be fully successful. So that's my thoughts on where the Air Force is going.
Okay, then. Well, Doug, I want to thank you for your insight and observations. To the audience, I want to thank you for viewing. This has been a Signal Media executive video.